From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm William Hague. My guest this month is my old friend, Lord Sebastian Coe, President of World Athletics and gold medal-winning Olympian. He's the man who brought the 2012 Olympics to London. We spoke about how he got our late Queen to agree to that helicopter stunt with James Bond in the opening ceremony.
The first person I spoke to was the Princess Royal. I had the challenge of explaining to her what was being thought, and Her Majesty would leave with James Bond. They'd get into the helicopter would fly underneath the bridges, and I would never in a million years have guessed the first question I got.
We covered his recent visit to Ukraine to understand the challenges their athletes are facing.
This trip for me was probably one of the profoundest trips I've ever taken, and arriving at a platform at the same time as a hospital train with an intensive care unit on board where life and death surgery is taking place.
And what about his position on one of the most divisive issues in sport right now, transgender athletes?
I am elected to protect and preserve the female category, because if I don't, then no woman will ever win another sporting event.
The story today, Seb Coe on banning athletes, doping, and finding a place for transgender competitors. So, Seb, what a pleasure to see you here on this podcast. You are one of the greatest athletes in the history of this country. You were an MP. Then you had the misfortune to be my chief of staff when I was leader of the opposition. Now you're presiding over World Athletics. Welcome to this podcast.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. And we did actually, in the dim, distant past, talk about doing a programme together. So here we are.
Well, here we are. This is it. And, of course, we both grew up in South Yorkshire. You in Sheffield and me in Rotherham. We didn't know each other at that time, but we did meet when we were both members of Parliament.
Our paths did actually cross on...
Go on, remind me.
Calendar, which was the regional
Yorkshire
news
television
programme. And you were on there for political reasons, and I was on there for sporting reasons. And I do remember... you won't want to be reminded of this, because it wasn't that long after your famous debut speech at the party conference.
When I was 16.
When you were 16.
Right.
And I was making my way...
I've entirely forgotten this.
Well, I was making my way through sort of the ranks of Yorkshire athletics and got invited on by the presenter of all things sport in Yorkshire, which was a guy called Roger Greenwood. And I remember leaving the studio clearly as your warm-up act.
Well, thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. Right. Okay, but then you became my chief of staff. And all those years later, we had some real ups and downs, didn't we, in that time? I mean, I was doing the hardest job as leader of the opposition. You'd been an MP for a fishing area in... Cornwall.
I know where this is going.
You arranged to take me to the fishing fleet at Fleetwood during the party conference in Blackpool, not anticipating the tide would go out and there'd be no fishing boats at all there when the world's media turned up with me. So not everything went very well, did it?
Not a great asset to have from somebody who actually did represent a fishing constituency on one of the few constituencies that has a north and a south coast. I should probably have known that, shouldn't I?
Right, you should have known that. But even so, we stayed very good friends, and I think you like to tell the story of when you were asked to be chair of the BBC, and I advised you not to do it, actually, more as a friend than... I didn't wish any harm to the BBC. I said, your sport needs you more than the BBC, and that's when you went into the International Athletics Federation that you have renamed World Athletics. And the very first day, the police turned up.
Not quite the first day. I think it was within the first week. And I do remember sitting there thinking, my best mate advised me a few months ago not to take the BBC job as it would be a poison chalice. And I quote, "I would lie down in the road if you go anywhere near Broadcasting House to get a job." Go to World Athletics. It needs you. And I think within the first week of having been elected, my receptionist came in and said to me, "There are some people to see you." And I automatically assumed it was a common courtesy, a piece of cake and maybe a glass of champagne. I had 17 policemen in the lobby. So 3 of them from Interpol and a guy called Judge Van Ranbeck, who announced that he was the senior prosecuting judge for cross-border corruption in France. And 5 hours later in a Monaco police station, I found that my predecessor had been arrested in Paris. His son was on the run. The general counsel had been arrested. The head of testing had been arrested. And my CEO had rather mercurially decided that he was going backpacking in Australia.
Well, it makes being leader of the Conservative Party. Yeah.
Thank you for the advice anyway.
Well, nevertheless, you've turned it around, haven't you? It's now 8 years on, is it?
It's 2015.
You've had 2 terms leading that organisation. It's got a very different standing in the world now.
Actually, funnily enough, it wasn't dissimilar to that period that you, as leader of the opposition, went through. And you very sensibly decided at that point that the most important thing you could do was actually to reform the party, the way it worked, the tiers of governance, the accountability that had sort of drifted. And that's exactly what I did for the first year and a half.
Yes, and recently you've announced major new athletics championships and so on, which I want to come on to later. Let's, because there you are, you have turned around world athletics in recent years, but you've got the credibility to do that because you're not only skilled in politics, you were a great athlete as well. How did your love of sport start?
Well, I've always loved sport. My parents, if they were around, would tell you that I always ran. I never wanted a bicycle because it just seemed to be cluttering.
A waste of time.
Yeah,
it would
and
you up.
I used to run regularly 2 or 3 miles as a kid we lived in Stratford-on-Avon, we lived on the edge of the town. I used to run there and run back, and I always found it quite easy and have always enjoyed the sensation of running. I still do. I mean, it's a very charitable description of what I do now, but I always think of my formative years as being in Yorkshire. I was there from the age of 10 until I sort of left, for university and other things. And I joined a lovely local athletics club in Sheffield, the Hallamshire Harriers. My mother was quite nervous about where her son was at the age of 11 or 12, going on a Sunday and a Tuesday and a Thursday. And she sent my father down. And he was a racing cyclist by background and an engineer, loved racing cycling. And actually, right at the end of his career, he was asked by a Times journalist whether he had any regrets. And he looked at them and said, "Yes, my son never won the Tour de France." So he was always
that would have been a bit much.
But he understood the nature of endurance. He understood the biomechanics because being a mechanical engineer, it's not that dissimilar. And so I was very, very lucky that I had somebody who spent really the first 5 years of my career learning and absorbing everything he possibly could. One of his great friends was head of languages at Sheffield University. And this poor guy used to spend most of his evenings and holidays translating all these texts that used to come in that he got from Germany and Russia and Japan about training. And it's a really interesting story because in the space of 5 years, he effectively turned himself into the middle distance coach of his generation.
And the result of that was that you were turned into the middle distance runner of your generation. I mean, there are 2 gold medals, 1 silver, but we won't go on about that one. This was all part of your...
It occasionally happens.
That intense rivalry with Steve Ovett. That was such a thing for people of my age and older than me. That was probably still one of the most memorable things in British athletics.
It really did capture the imagination. And of course, it all came to a head around the Olympic Games. And he and I have spoken about this subsequently. And we were actually very pleased that the big moment where we did go head to head was in an Olympic setting and not in a commercialised event, which people would probably have forgotten.
And I remember getting on a plane with you many years ago when you were working for me, and we were surprised to find Steve Ovett was sitting there. He'd got on the plane ahead of us. And there he was sitting, and he looked at me and he said, "William, I'm so jealous of you." And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Because wherever you go, Seb is always behind you. And that is where I wanted to keep him all those years, but I couldn't." But
No, I mean, it's interesting. We came from very different backgrounds and geographically. I was brought up in the north, effectively. I came from, and two very different ends of the sport. He was a sprinter. He was more a 400-metre athlete. I was cross-country, road, and everything that the north of England had to offer. And he was precociously talented. In his late teens, he was a European medalist while I was still trotting around cross-country courses in Halifax and Bradford. And I then came down distance. He went up distance from the sprints, and we sort of collided really at both 8 and 1500, middle ground, middle distance.
And then there was Steve Cram as well. I mean, it was an extraordinary period. And people will look back and think, well, why don't we have... Of course, we've got some great athletes, but it doesn't seem as extraordinary whatsoever, the British athletics today.
The British athletics actually is going through a bit of renaissance at the moment. And interestingly, the race that everybody is looking forward to in Paris, in my sport athletics, is the head-to-head between the Norwegian athlete Inge Britsen and a Scottish athlete, Josh Kerr, who won the World Championships last year in Budapest and beat Inge Britsen. And both of them are absolutely at the top of their game. So it could be that the 1,500 metres with a British athlete is centrepiece in Paris. I think we were beneficiaries of something else at the time. And if you think back to the late 70s, early 80s, our national sports were really, really underperforming. Football was not a good product. Parents weren't particularly comfortable about their kids going to football grounds because of the hooliganism. Cricket was in and out. Rugby, we were getting... Your wife will remember this, getting slaughtered by the Welsh on a pretty regular basis.
Well, that is part of the United Kingdom, so that's a lot. Some of us can take pride in that.
Exactly. But the reality of it was that for the very first time, athletics started to develop some big names. Daley Thompson, Tessa Sanderson, Steve Ovett. And we weren't just winning domestic competitions or even European competitions. We were suddenly actually... in our own disciplines, the best in the world. We were often leading the back page. Brendan Foster, always interestingly, tells me a story that in a way demonstrates that. Newcastle United would ring up Gateshead Harriers when he was presenting one of the big athletics meetings and say, "Are you planning to stage your track meet on the Friday or the Saturday afternoon?" And if he said the Saturday afternoon, Newcastle United would move their match to Friday night. Now, that would not be happening now.
Well, let's go on to the Olympics, because there you are. You're a great Olympian yourself. And after you'd been in politics, which didn't work out that well, because you lost your seat and then you worked for me. And
timing is everything.
I didn't become Prime Minister as you'd been hoping. But you then went on to achieve much greater things, because you managed to bring the Olympics to London for 2012. Tell us something about that. You managed to persuade the late Queen to take part in the James Bond spoof short film. Tell us how you managed to do that.
Well, I went on a Radio 5 interview one afternoon about the bid. Actually, shortly after we'd won. And Danny Boyle was on there being celebrated for Slumdog Millionaire. In the margins of the discussion while we were all sort of clearing the studios and the traffic news on, I said, "You don't know me, but let me thank you for the film." I explained my background. And I said, "I took my son to it last night." He then turned to me and said, "Well, congratulations on the Games. I think it's a fabulous idea and I'll do anything I can to help." And I thought, well, I'm not going to lose this opportunity. I said, well, look, let's talk. And as I'm going out, Simon Mayer, a very, very good broadcaster, was smart enough to hear what he heard and said, "I can't leave you to go. I want you both to repeat this conversation on air." And I thought, this is the moment to pin him down. So he said, I'll make tea, I'll do anything. And I went to see him a few weeks later. He agreed to become the creative director. He wanted to create something that was understandably British enough, but recognising that we were hosting over 200 countries in the stadium on the same night. And he wanted to show the path from, agrarian economy to internet. And then I did feel the globe wobbling when he walked in one day and he said, I've done a bit of market research. And the two most globally recognised figures from the UK in this order is the Queen and James Bond. And I was buying right up to the moment he said, wouldn't it be great to get them to jump out of a helicopter together? And to cut a long story short, yes, I sort of helped around the scenes. And again, this is where relationships are really important, because if you remember, Ed Young was one of your press officers. Mm-hmm. So the first person I rang...
the Queen's private secretary.
Exactly. I rang up Ed Young and he said, look, this is going to be quite a challenge. Leave it with me. And the first person I spoke to was the Princess Royal, who, of course, was on the organising committee board as president of the British National Olympic Committee and IOC president. To cut a long story short, I had the challenge of explaining to her what was being thought, and Her Majesty would leave with James Bond. They'd get into the helicopter would fly underneath the bridges, and they'd and I would never in a million years have guessed the first question I got, because having sort of fumbled my way through this creative with all these boards, just the two of us in a room, she looked at me and said, what kind of helicopter? And I'm thinking, and she looked at me slightly imbecilic. And, it can't be a Chinook, because the downdraft would take it into the river. And, of course, I'd realised that there was not a helicopter.
Royals know helicopters very well.
And, it would maybe a sea king, anyway, the reality of it was actually Danny Boyle that went into the palace and sold the concept to her. And I was very pleased she said yes.
Well, it was one unforgettable part of a completely unforgettable Olympic Games, which you presided over. And now we're coming up to the Paris Olympic Games. Are they prepared? Are they? What are we going to expect from the Olympic Games in Paris?
I hope that they are a really good Games. And look, first of all, security has got to be top of everybody's mind. We had the shadow of 7/7, the unspeakable act of barbarity the day after we won the Games in London. And the world is, this as well as anybody, the world is a lot more complicated now than it was in 2012. The biggest single element on the risk cloud in 2012 was Fathers for Justice, who were sort of climbing up buildings. Yes. And if it's anything like London, the right people are in the right place with the right agencies, and a good smattering of Met Police as well.
And within that, you've just been to Ukraine.
Yes.
You met President Zelensky.
Yes.
You went, I think, to see the particular difficulties faced by the team there preparing for the Olympics. So what did you learn in Ukraine?
Goodness me. I went to an exhibition in France just yesterday of Turner. And I was taken by a quote as I walked in, which was, "My business is to paint what I see, not what I know is there." And this trip for me was probably one of the profoundest trips I've ever taken. And I've seen some interesting things. But I think boarding that train at the Polish border, and, that's the only way in, really, to the country. And then arriving at a platform at the same time as a hospital train with an intensive care unit on board where life and death surgery is taking place, bringing people back from the front, and a sea of ambulances and families waiting for good or bad news. And then leaving Kiev that night, having met the president, having been to destroyed sporting facilities, some of which had been targeted knowing that only 10 minutes earlier children had arrived to start a sporting day. And then leaving in the evening to another hospital train coming in. We made a judgment, William, not for politics or passports, but the integrity of our sport was so in question. And the ability of a Ukraine team, which would number 75 under normal circumstances, now down to under 30, predominantly female. 150 athletes have lost their lives. I went to a war grave to honour them. And the thought that we would give the full panoply of a championships unimpeded to such aggressive nations, just we couldn't do that as the International Federation, all 26 members unanimously voted to exclude them.
So you've banned Russian and Belarusian athletes from athletics, right? And
yes.
and that is why. And that is, just explain for people the difference between your position and, as I understand it, the International Olympic Committee position and some other sports, which is that those people, those Russians, they can't compete as Russia, but they can compete as independent athletes, neutral athletes in some ways.
We made the judgment that, for the reasons I've just given, that it was inconceivable that we could have a Ukraine team so denuded in numbers and coaches fighting on the front line and athletes fighting, the male athletes on the front line, and a lot of the women there in similar positions, and medical support, that we made the judgment that that was just inconsistent. Other sports chose to take the other way. And look, I genuinely believe that we made a decision that was in the best interest of our sport, and that all international federations must have autonomy and independence in making those decisions. And I accept that the International Olympic Committee should. So I'm not really criticising other sports for taking a different view.
And I agree with you, really, but you could say, someone with a different point of view could say, well, look, there are many wars in the world. What's going on in Sudan? What has been done by the government of Myanmar? What is Israel doing in Gaza? Shouldn't there be a lot more nations then that are banned if Russia is banned? What would be your answer to that?
I absolutely concede that there is consistency in that argument. I mean, two things. First of all, it doesn't come easily to me or my natural disposition or my council. Many of my council are Olympic champions as well, world record holders, world champions. Our default position is not to stop athletes competing. I'm not very good at the what about argument. You can only confront what is in front of you. And the world sanctioned Russia, sanctioned it financially, it sanctioned it politically, culturally, and we took the position that I think was in line with pretty much where most people were. I also accept that we probably have set some precedents. And Gaza, Israel is a raw and current challenge. And that may well be, in time, something that we do have to address. But Russia was sanctioned globally. The Israel-Palestine issue is hugely complex, and it has been going on for many years. We're not a government, we're not a political party. The world is complicated, but I just did not want to fall into the what about. There are plenty of genuine what abouts, which in time we will probably have to look at.
There are a lot of big issues in sport now on which you seem to have a clear view on all of them. Russia is one of them that we've just talked about, but there's doping. Doping in sport's been a challenge for quite a long time. And I think you've said Paris will be no different. There'll still be an issue. Technology will help, though. How will it help? What are the recent breakthroughs on that?
Well, first of all, we now have an integrity unit that independently tests. So, for instance, I'm the president of the global sport. I have no idea at this moment who is under investigation. And this is a unit that is entirely independent. It's got 30 or 40 people in it. Many of them have investigative skills, intelligence-led. So it's not just about the number of tests. Lots of sports talk about number of tests. Well, it's a bit meaningless. Actually, it's how do you target those tests? How do you understand what the networks are? How are the entourage in the background operating? Who is actually often encouraging the athletes into that? subterfuge. And again, it comes down to for me, it's just simple integrity. You can't have a sport where people enter it thinking that I'm disadvantaged because I'm in lane 3 and there are a better set of chemists behind the scenes in lane 2 and lane 4.
Another big issue in sport on which you've taken a clear position is about transgender people. That's posing questions for sport. And you've said that female Olympians would never win a gold medal again if they had to compete against trans women athletes. Explain why that is your position to exclude trans women athletes.
William, I'm elected to do a number of things. The stewardship of the sport. And one very key element in that sport is that we have male and female competitors. Our female athletes are as popular as the male athletes. Our sport is entirely 50-50. From the age of 11, getting on school coaches in South Yorkshire to go to events in Doncaster or Rotherham, the coach was 50-50. That's how I grew up. That's what the sport was about. And I am elected to protect and preserve the female category, because if I don't, then no woman will ever win another sporting event. What we've said is we will not have transgender athletes competing at the elite level in our sport, because it is a game changer. And it's not a good game changer.
And for you, you've looked at there's no other solution like testing testosterone levels.
You could, but when I looked at this closely with our health and science teams, and I'm probably slightly biased, they are best in class, nobody could actually say to me, if you actually had testosterone controlling protocols, is that going to have an impact over 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? Work that had been done was not conclusive, and I wasn't really prepared to take the risk. So we've created a working group, and on that working group is a transgender athlete. We're not sort of closing the door forever. We will monitor the science. I don't have the disposition or even the jurisdiction to prevent transgender athletes competing in the Falmouth 5K fun run to raise money for a local hospice. I don't want to do that. I feel I don't have the right to do that. And actually, it's physicality is a good thing. But narrowly defined, this will have is already in lower levels of the sport, having an impact. And it wasn't a risk I was prepared to take. Now, my successors in years to come may look at this and decide that there are other considerations. But at the moment, the science is certainly not clear-cut enough to take that risk.
So what do you say to trans athletes who want to compete at international level? What you just said, that is a process for the future, but they're not able to in world athletics at the moment.
At this moment, at the elite level, the answer is no.
Where does that leave them then? What?
I'm afraid to say that leaves them not competing at the elite level.
Okay, so it's a bleak outlook for those athletes. Again, I agree with your position, but we have to think about those individuals.
These are absolutely the right questions, and I also recognise that for anybody going through that journey, that is a painful process. Psychologically, this is big territory. And we have spoken to the transgender community. I really do understand the pain that often lies behind this, but I also do have a responsibility to preserve the female category in athletics, and that is where we are at this moment.
And just talking of looking after people, I just noticed the story recently about Sir Bradley Wiggins, great Olympic hero. He was such a figure in your Olympics in 2012. Now effectively homeless, it seems. Obviously, something's really gone wrong for him. Do we need to care for our athletes better? Does someone have a duty of care?
I actually tend to think so. Look, I don't entirely understand the background. It was explained to me by people whose judgment I value that were in cycling at the time, that there had been a series of of issues. You know, when you have a pathology like that, there are many. It's many faceted. But no, when retirement beckons, it is a challenge for athletes. I mean, I was very lucky. I retired at the end of 1989, and 4 weeks after retiring, I was a candidate for Falmouth and Camborne. So I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew I wanted to go into politics actually long before I thought I was going to be particularly successful in athletics. And the only thing I would say to athletes, I do say, is when you retire, try, where possible, to have a transitional plan 3 years in advance. Don't just wake up the first morning and go, well, you know, normally my day would be dominated and built around training, and suddenly it's not there. Mm-hmm. Now, that's easier. I recognize that is easier for some than others. But I do think you're right. I think international federation, national Olympic committees do have a responsibility where possible to do whatever they can to help in that transitional period. And even for the most successful athletes, it's a painful process. Some don't come out of it very well. And then you have all the other issues that we weren't talking about even 10 years ago. You know, the mental well-being, mental health issues, which mercifully are now being discussed in a much more open way than ever before. And look, I was actually party to a discussion about Bradley the other day, so let's hope somebody picks that up.
Yeah. And looking to the future of sport, we're not doing that well in the UK at health and fitness. It seems 50% of young people don't meet the chief medical officer's guidelines for daily activity. Mm. Any advice for the new government as to what they can do about that?
When we got out of the Games, I remember sitting with David Cameron during Mo Farah's 10,000 metres, and about 4 laps from home, David turned to me and he said, what should we do about legacy? And I said, Prime Minister, do you mind if we just get the next 4 laps out of the way? And then I'll sort of... Anyway, to cut a long story short, I was very pleased to spend 2 years working, as you would remember, in that cabinet committee that looked at this. And the one thing that we did do very well was we recognised that this isn't just about saying it's a National Health Service problem if it's obesity. It's about planning. It's about freeing up space. It's about tax and spend. If you think it's virtuous to have 0 rating on books or school clothing, why are we not doing that on gym memberships? Mm. I mean, I remember going into a school in East London in my role in the Cabinet Office saying, you know, knowing the answer to the question, well, why don't you cycle to school? Well, the bikes are expensive, and if we do, they get stolen. And if we walk, we go through gang boundaries. That's not National Health Service. That's about local policing. It's about law and order. So for the very first time, we had a coherent approach across transport, across health, across CLG, across Treasury. And they all sat, I mean, some of them cabinet ministers of state sat, and we met every few weeks, and we sort of drove this. Then, of course, we had a change of leadership, and that didn't have quite the same priority. So my advice to Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister, would be, look at this holistically.
Right.
This isn't something that the NHS is designed to deal with or particularly well-placed to deal with. You have to have across government, across departmental recognition that every department has a role to play here.
So after many changes of Prime Minister, embarrassingly under my party, there might be the chance now to rebuild some of that strategy that you were working on.
I really hope so, because I think 2 things about sport. One is that it is the most potent social worker we have in any community. It does it better than any other sector. It does it 24/7, and it's doing it at this very moment. With coaches that are often the only male or female role models in the lives of young people. And at an international level, utilised properly, it's one of the deftest of diplomats as well. But the most important thing is to recognise the best health or education policy is a good sports policy, because so much will lead from that.
And they could, young people who emerge through that could aspire in the future, thanks to you, to the world athletics' ultimate Championships, which is what you have recently announced. So, as I understand that, you're going to have in the mid-year of the Olympic Games, in the 2 years in between, starting in 2026, 400 of the world's top athletes are going to compete with some serious prize money.
Yes.
Which is another thing you've brought into world athletics. So now what's this? Is this your legacy? Is this the... Look, is this for you the crowning thing you're bringing on top of all those reforms that you talked about earlier into world athletics?
I'm hoping it will act as an incubator for change. It's a 3-night, 3-hour program. It's unashamedly designed for television with a sensible prize pot, which I like athletes to have some financial stability in their careers, and a new model that allows a city to actually benefit more from our championships. And I think there are things that we can do in that 3 days that will sharpen the mind. It won't replace our 9-day World Championships where you have over 200 countries competing, but I hope that there are things that we can take from that allow us to be more exciting, more interesting, more salient in the lives of young people, and more exciting for young people to want to go and join an athletics club.
And so what's next for you? It's a pretty unique combination of experience that you have. The president of the IOC's term expires next year. Is there another big job for you?
Does it? That's the question.
Oh, well, I don't know. You tell me if it doesn't.
No, we don't know, because there is some suggestion that, there might be a term extension. So there's no clear situation at the moment. So I'm going to give you a very political answer and say that I am focusing entirely on the next 3 years.
I, of all people, understand that. But that would, in any event, be continuing your work at World Athletics.
Yes, for sure.
And you are a spring chicken in American presidential terms.
I'm not sure that's a great benchmark.
Many more years in you yet. And finally, any reflection on that? We just had the election in which our old dear party had its most catastrophic defeat. We've talked about the opportunities for the new government in sport and health. Any other reflections on what's just happened in the UK?
Goodness me, how long have we got? Look, I'm a great believer that when the public make their mind up, it's not always because of national insurance rates or, particular facets of policy. The British electorate tend to have an unerring nose for when it is time for a change. Personally, I sort of pretty much thought that's where we were 2 or 3 years ago. I think the one thing that is probably more profound now than it's ever been is the electorate is febrile, makes decisions that are not based on any of the nostrums that you and I sort of accepted, that there was a loyalty. I mean, I've got 4 kids. I don't begin to know how they voted, but they will have voted in very different ways for very different reasons. And again, looking back on our period, the only advice I would give, and it's probably seen as not particularly helpful, but don't do anything in a rush, because the thought that anybody is out there listening to anything that is being said, use this as a period of reflection, make the internal changes, do it behind closed doors, do it in a way that will allow you the platform, and just don't veer off into the margins. That would be a huge error. Funnily
enough, we're giving them the same advice from the same bitter experience. And really, finally, now, how fast are you now in your late 60s? I think we need to know.
Well, it's more an hourglass than a stopwatch now. I run every other day, and I run for an hour, and over the course of a weekend, if the weather is semi-decent, I'll probably run for 2 hours outside. So I'm lucky in that I haven't sort of had deep-seated or injuries. My knees are mine, my hips are mine, and I still do a sort of conditioning program every other day. So long may that remain. I'll just keep my fingers crossed.
Well, Sebastian Coe, Lord Coe, head of World Athletics, my great mate, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
William, thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
That was my old friend, Seb Coe, president of World Athletics. Today's producer was Olivia Case. The executive producer was Kate Ford. Sound design and theme composition was by Maula Seto, and I'm William Hague. Do leave us a review, it helps others find us, and if you have any questions or ideas, you can get in touch at thestory@thetimes.com. Join me next time when I'll be talking to Yuval Noah Harari, author of Sapiens and Homo Deus, about his upcoming book, Nexus. See you then.